Hi, I'm Sam, and today I'll be presenting my work with Mark Díaz, exploring how people try to understand and be understood when communicating using machine translation. Often, people turn to machine translation when they need to communicate in a language that they don't know. One of the challenges with this is that it can be impossible to know whether a translation is correct. For example, say I arrived in South Korea for this conference, and I wanted to get some eggs to make my favorite breakfast. I don't speak Korean, so how am I supposed to know whether the person I'm asking will know what I mean, or if I'll end up with thousands of eggs on my doorstep, like the Norwegian Olympic team did in 2018? While translation errors like this one can be inconvenient or maybe a little entertaining, this problem can have much more dire consequences, especially as machine translation is becoming increasingly widespread and available for use in high-stakes contexts. For instance, in this example, where a Palestinian man was arrested after his post saying good morning to his Facebook friends was mistranslated and misinterpreted by Israeli police. Our goal in this work was to understand how users identify translation errors, if they can at all, and when they do identify errors, understand how they recover. Specifically, we studied this in the context of machine translation-mediated text chat. To do this, we brought together 19 pairs of participants across 5 languages: English, Spanish, Farsi, Igbo, and Tagalog, and we had the pairs role-play one of 3 high-stakes housing and employment scenarios. During the conversation, participants only saw the messages that they sent, which were automatically translated using the Google Translate API and forwarded to their partner, and then the translations of their partner's message. So everything they saw was in one language only. Prior research has conducted similar types of user studies, and afterwards it's common to ask the participants, how did it go? This can give us really interesting insights into users' perceptions of translation quality, but it doesn't let us gain any insight into whether those perceptions are actually accurate. In our study, we made sure that at least one participant in each session knew both of the languages. Then, in a debrief interview, we showed them the full transcript of both sides of the conversation, so that they could assess the translation quality directly. So what did we find from adding this additional step? We saw that people had major challenges identifying translation errors during the chat. Often, people relied heavily on fluency, both fluency of individual translations, as well as just the flow of the dialogue overall. They would assume that if things seemed fluent, then they were understanding each other well. However, this fluency could be misleading, because fluency doesn't always mean that the translation is adequately conveying the intended meaning of the source message. Let's look at an example of a misunderstanding that wasn't caught by the participants until the debrief interview. In this session, we had an English speaker playing the role of a parent looking for a nanny, and then someone who spoke both Igbo and English playing the role of the nanny. This conversation was going well until the parent participant asked, "One of my children has a cashew allergy. Do you have experience taking care of children with allergies? If so, have you had training with an EpiPen?" The Igbo participant said this message was confusing, but guessed that it meant that the children were stubborn or always get themselves into trouble. Going with that interpretation, they responded, "I can handle them." The parent took that as acceptance that they had understood each other, and they moved forward with the conversation, not realizing that they weren't on the same page at all. These kinds of total misunderstandings were not the only problem arising from participants' difficulty identifying translation errors. Participants said messages came across abrupt, demanding, rude, not respectful, blaming, or even flirtatious, and then often attributed that to the other person without realizing that the model had just failed to convey the intended tone or register. This not only impacted people's judgments of the other person, but actually how they began to interact with each other. For example, one participant said, "Now that I'm looking at it in English, it looks like the other person's messages would just be as if I was chatting with a friend. But I guess a translator makes it more formal, so I was responding more formal, based on how the messages were translating." So we've talked about some problems that came up when people can't identify translation errors. But what about when they can tell that something's wrong? What are they able to do to recover? It turns out that people have a lot of strategies, but it's not necessarily easy to make them work. I'll discuss 2 examples here, and we talk about a few more in the paper. First, it's common for people to guess the meaning of a translation based on a few key words, try to rely just on the gist of the message, or even ignore parts of a message altogether and take the conversation in just a different direction if they can't understand what the other person is trying to say. We also saw that many participants tried to carefully craft their messages to be closer to something that they thought a machine would be able to translate well. But these strategies didn't always work out well in practice. We saw earlier what can happen when one user guesses the meaning of a confusing translation. The other person might never realize that they've guessed incorrectly, and a total misunderstanding can go completely unnoticed. It's also really difficult to craft messages that are easy for a model to translate. People had good ideas for how to do this, like using correct spelling and grammar, avoiding metaphorical language, but it was difficult to apply these consistently while also focusing on the conversation, especially in a casual format like text chat. As an example, can you spot what about these two sentences might trip up a translation model? These are real examples from our study. The first one was translated to Farsi using the word for a person standing up, so water literally standing in the bathroom. And the second was translated to Spanish using the literal word for window. You can imagine how hard it would be to catch these in real time as you're having a conversation with someone. So to summarize what we found, we saw that users don't have a way to identify and recover from errors in machine translation-mediated chat, at least not reliably. So what could we do to better support users in this process? Well, there are well-established principles of user interface design that are relevant here. For example, we would typically want to prevent system errors whenever it's possible. And when it's not possible to avoid an error, we really should help users recognize the error, diagnose the cause, and recover from it. However, these are really challenging principles to apply to machine learning systems, where errors are inevitable, and preempting them is often as hard, if not harder, than making a good prediction in the first place. So how can we draw on these principles to design more reliable machine translation systems? We suggest a few directions. For example, we could increase the visibility of machine translation systems so that people are less likely to forget that it's in use and that very fluent translations may still not convey the correct meaning. Another strategy could be to offer repair mechanisms that circumvent the translation model entirely. For example, offering ways of sending an emoji to indicate that a message is confusing, or pre-translated utterances that indicate that you haven't understood a particular part of a message. A last strategy could be to offer better guidance around system capabilities and limitations, teaching people over time how to use these models in a safe and reliable way. To end, I want to address a common concern about this last path forwards. Won't offering users more guidance constrain our language around the arbitrary dictates of a machine translation model? And the answer, we think, is yes, but that it's better for users to understand the limitations of these systems and be able to use them safely and reliably than for them to have to run into errors on their own that they may not be able to identify. Instead, it's our responsibility as technology developers to continue to ensure that we're not reinforcing these constraints, but rather working with users to expand support for their needs in the future. Thank you so much for listening to this talk, and I hope you'll check out our paper for much more detail about what we found and what we think are the most promising paths forward in this space.